and welcome back to part 5 of my series of sewing with stretch. Now today we're going to talk about all the things that can go wrong. Seriously? Have we got time for that? I hope you've enjoyed all 4 videos that I've done so far. This was going to be a 5-part series, but actually it's going to be a 6-part series, and maybe there'll be more in future because I've said more than once in the series that it's such a huge subject. I've decided to do a bonus video for tomorrow about the patterns that I use with stretch. So this was all based on my self-drafted pattern of cloning a t-shirt, but if you want a pattern that you can go out there and buy, then there's going to be a video tomorrow about what I use. Before we get into the video, I'd love it if you would subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Give all the videos that you like a thumbs up. Please ask questions in the comments down below and get involved in the conversation. It's lovely to have you here. Let's get into it. What I've done is I've collated loads of feedback from you guys, lots of very wise advice, and I'm going to share it on here. And also the video I was wearing, the top I was wearing yesterday, the black and white striped top, I have fixed that dodgy neckband. So I'm going to show you how I fixed that. The first place that things go wrong is in cutting out. The first video in the series was all about cutting out. And if you're not accurate in cutting out, you end up with seams that aren't the same length, armholes that maybe don't match. So it is worth taking your time with that and using whatever technique that you have the tools available to do and the technique that you're comfortable with that gets you the best results. We all work differently. I'm not here to say I know the one right way, because there isn't a one right way to do any of these things. Mary Mac, sorry if I murder anybody's name, Mary Mac asked a question. She said, I've only got a small cutting mat, but I do have a rotary cutter. Is that still going to work? And I think you could probably make that work. So I've got various sized cutting mats. Here we go. This is a smaller one I've got. I don't know what size Mary Mac's got, but maybe you've got a smaller one. And if you were careful, you could kind of slide that around as you were cutting, and you could get a good result with that. With any of the methods, the key is to not let the fabric shift so that the shape of the pattern piece is the shape that you cut out of the fabric. Sounds simple, but often it's not easy to get that. But as long as your fabric's not moving as you move the cutting mat, I don't see why that shouldn't work. A lot of the gadgets that I've talked about in this series are not all that cheap. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. But I think that cutting mats have come down a lot in price recently, so you can get a big A1 size cutting mat, which is the size I showed you, for not much more than £20. So it's relatively affordable as well if you wanted to trade up. But equally, you don't have to. In the comments to the cutting video, Kathy Gadd, if you're squeamish, you don't want to go back and read this comment, but let's just say that Kathy shared the fact that I was right to point out that rotary cutters are really sharp, and it gets more dangerous the tougher the fabric that you're cutting them with, because you're really tempted to use some force, and when you use some force, if your finger's in the way, you ain't got time to stop. So yeah, thank you for sharing your gruesome story, Kathy, and I'm very glad that your finger recovered. But do be careful. And then finally, Heather Thompson, I've got my notes down here, Heather Thompson had a really great tip, which is if your fabric's really stretchy and really misbehaves, then you can iron it onto wax paper. Now I've used wax paper for the really tiny pattern pieces that I make my fabric birds with. I've never used it on a large scale. I think it's easier to get hold of in the US than the UK, but that is changing. And if I can find a UK link to it, I'll put it down below. I'll try and find a US link too. Wax paper, I think it was originally developed for use in freezers to stop food sticking together, but it's got a slightly waxy thing that surface that melts and sticks itself to your fabric, but it is subtle enough that on pretty much all fabrics, you can then tear the fabric and the paper apart when you've finished, and it doesn't leave any residue, or certainly nothing that doesn't wash out. Clearly you have to test, especially if you're using something really precious and special, and I would generally always iron the wrong side of your fabric onto the wax paper, just in case. But yeah, that's a great way, and once your fabric is on the paper, it is as stable as paper, so it ain't moving anywhere. So really great tip, thank you for sharing, Heather. Last thing about cutting out is cutting out your pattern. As I said, I based this on a self-drafted pattern, and there'll be a link to how I self-drafted or cloned the pattern at the end of this video and down below. I realise now, having made it 5 times, that there are some issues with my pattern that I could have checked for at the start. So I did check the length of the side seam. So if you're cloning, this is just some things to check, sort of a checklist. Go through this to make sure your pattern's going to be as easy to use as possible. Check that the front and back side seams are the same length, okay? And when you've cut your pattern piece out, if you really want to, you could check that they're the same length. But if your pattern is the same, then the fabric should be the same. Where I ran into difficulty was in two places. The width of my front and my back are significantly different. Now, depending on your body shape, they may be slightly different, although if you are cloning from ready to wear, there really ought not to be a massive difference. If you're not deliberately trying to make them different, then the width should be largely the same. 1 or 2 centimetres, not an issue, but I've got a couple of inches different. I'm not sure where that came from. I think it came from the fact that I was trying to trace off a really stretchy fabric, and I overstretched the back possibly and understretched the front. So I need to address that in my pattern. And then also the armholes. So your arm pattern piece it's got the cap shape at the top, hasn't it? And then it's got the sleeve bit. The sleeve part of that should always be slightly smaller than the armhole, and you'll have to measure the front pattern piece armhole and the back pattern piece armhole, and then do a bit of maths because you have to add them together. It won't hurt. So the sleeve should be slightly smaller, but not a lot smaller. So only 1 or maybe 2 centimetres smaller. So you have to slightly stretch the sleeve piece to get it in, because that gets a good fit. For me, it's really out of balance. The back armhole is way bigger, the front armhole is too small. It all comes down to this mistake I think I made when I traced off my pattern, which is I've made the small a bit too small and the big a bit too big. And I didn't notice to begin with, and I didn't realise the difference it was going to make. So those are things that you need to check. And also the other seam is check that the front and back are the same. Now on mine, that isn't a problem I had actually, but do check that the front piece and the back piece are the same along this line too. So just get your ruler out and do a couple of safety checks at the start, and that will save you a lot of heartache later, because if your pattern starts off wrong, everything else that follows is going to be tricky. You'll be able to deal with it because I've made loads of t-shirts with that faulty pattern, but they would have been easier to make if it hadn't been faulty. Moving on to the sewing. In the second video in the series, I talked about woolly nylon. Love this thread. It's really useful, and you can use it in overlockers, in the loopers, as I said, and in cover stitch machines, as I said. But someone, Anne Borbage, you asked quite rightly, can I use it in a regular sewing machine in the bobbin? And I referred to Barbara Modi's article to find out, because I've never done that, but I did have a sense that I thought I'd read that you could, and indeed you can. You can use woolly nylon thread in the bobbin of a regular machine in order to give that stretch. So what Barbara used it for was doing literally just a straight line around her t-shirt hem, as you would if you were using a woven fabric, but because there is a stretchy thread in the bobbin, it means that straight stitch doesn't pop and break when it's stretched, but it actually gives and flexes. So as I've said quite a few times, you'd need to experiment, and the key thing about using it in your bobbin is you must hand wind the woolly nylon onto the bobbin thread. So you can't whiz it off on your machine and wind up the bobbin that way. You need to hand wind it, and I would imagine, refer to Barbara's article, there'll be a link down below, but I would imagine the reason why you are hand winding is because you don't want to pull it really tightly at tension. It needs to be loose and fairly woolly, but tight enough that it stays on the bobbin without causing problems. So that might take a little bit of trial and error, but it can be done. Another thing I've heard of and never used, so I can't vouch for it, but I've heard good things, is that there are now actually stretch threads that are for sale, and they are supposed, and apparently with fairly good results, to be able to be used in regular machines and other machines to do straight stitches that then have some give in them. I had a really nice comment from Heather Thompson who said, yeah, you talk about overlockers and cover stitch, but I've got a regular machine and I do everything on my regular machine. And big thumbs up, Heather, because you totally can do everything on a regular machine, and I don't want to be seen to stand here and say you need to spend all the money and you need the gadgets, because what Heather and I had a little message chat about was actually, when it comes to sewing, this is probably a broader thing, but it's about the familiarity with your machines and the skill of what you're trying to do. It's not that an overlocker or a cover stitch is a magic gadget that you're just going to be able to pay your money, get the thing out of the box, put it on your sewing table, and everything will be fine. If you are used to your regular machine, and if you do things on your regular machine and they work, then stay with that. If they work, why break it, you know? I love using my overlocker, and for me, I think it gives results that I like better, but it doesn't mean that that's how you have to feel about it. So it was great for Heather to comment and to remind me, so I could share with you that, you know, actually it is, all of sewing is often way more about practice and developing the skill than it is about a gadget. Julie asked about overlockers or sergers, you know that. She said, I've got no seam gauge on my overlocker. How am I supposed to know whether I'm sewing at the right point? So we all know seam allowances are important. If a pattern's got 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, you don't want to sew smaller or bigger than that, or vice versa. Worth knowing that quite common on knit patterns that it's just 1 centimetre seam allowance to accommodate for sergers. So my overlocker does have a seam gauge, but I'm going to take you and show you it now because I have a very, very complicated gadget that helps me know where I need to head my machine. So here we are, this is my overlocker, and as you can see under here it does have seam gauges, just little lines that in theory you put the edge of your fabric against as you are sewing, and that will give you certain widths. However, I don't actually find those lines very reliable. I'm not sure if they're working from the left or the right needle, because of course on an overlocker you can do a 3-thread or a 4-thread stitch. Yeah, so what I did instead was I got some masking tape, or what would be called washi tape or paper tape. This is frog tape in the UK. It's just coloured masking tape. There's no need for it to be coloured. And I stuck it on. So what I do when I have a new project, if I know what the seam allowance is that I'm aiming for, I take my seam gauge, or indeed my tape measure. So we take our tape measure, and I'm not sure this is going to be a straight angle, but you line up the edge of your tape measure with the needle, and then whatever your seam allowance is, so say it's 1 centimetre, I hate using the end of this tape measure because of the gold spot, so if I line that up with the needle at 3, then I can see that in this instance my left needle and the edge of the white plastic is 1 centimetre apart. So if my seam allowance is 1 centimetre, then I can just use the edge of the fabric, the edge of the plastic, as the line I need to line up to. If you had a bigger seam allowance, you would take that masking tape off and you would just line the edge of it up wherever you need to go. That works on your regular sewing machine too as well. It's a great little tip. So you can just measure it once, line up the needle with whatever, and then measure away 1 centimetre, 1.5, 2, whatever seam allowance your project has, put the masking tape there, and then you've got a guide that you don't forget what it is. I like the orange tape because I don't miss it. It's really bright, and that solves that problem. So turns out I told you a big fat lie, probably more than once to be honest. I didn't do it deliberately, but Carla Santos mentioned that she'd recently had a birthday, or maybe it was a Christmas present, of an overlocker blind stitch attachment. And when she said that, I was like, yeah, I did know that. And there I was in my hemming video saying, yeah, your overlocker, it's no use for hemming. Yeah, just chuck it in the bin. And it's not true, because you can do hems with your overlocker. And in fact, having looked into it a bit more, and my brain and the memory banks in my brain waking up and dusting themselves off, you can even do hems on an overlocker without any form of attachment. I have linked to a video in my playlist, and I'll put a link down below, from another YouTube channel showing you a tutorial of doing that. Now, it's called doing a blind hem, you don't get a blind hem, so it's a bit of a and it's a little bit tricky because you've got to be super accurate with how you line it up. But as I just said a moment ago, sewing is often all about the skill and not about a magic gadget. So all that a blind hem foot does is make the lining up easier. So if that's something you struggle with. And when I looked for my machine, it was about £40. So it's not a cheap thing, but it's not as expensive as a cover stitch. Is anything as expensive as a cover stitch? Maybe not. What you get if you do a hem on an overlocker is, as I said, it's not blind. So if this is your fabric running this way, you get tiny little vertical stitches. And if you have a look on a ready-to-wear t-shirt, that is often a finish that they choose to use deliberately. And you can make it show deliberately. You can use really invisible thread. You could literally use invisible thread, which you can get from Empress Mills in the UK. Or you could use contrasting thread, or you can use thread that's the same colour that kind of melts into the background of your fabric, not literally, but in a colour way. So it's often it's a ready-to-wear finish, and so you can use your serger / overlocker for doing hems. My apologies for completely forgetting that. Again, from the hemming video, Julie Riles asked, can I use a twin needle with a walking foot? And as far as I know, the answer is yes. As long as you're doing a straight stitch. I don't think there would be space to do a zigzag twin needle. There's my mime of a zigzag twin needle with a walking foot, but I'm pretty sure you could do a straight stitch, because I know on my machine I can do a very wide zigzag stitch with the walking foot. Okay, and what defines whether you can do a stitch with a foot or not is that hole in the middle of the foot that the needle has to get down. And what you don't want is for your machine to be trying to get through the metal of the foot, because that ain't never going to happen. Okay, but you can use a twin needle with a walking foot, and that's a really, really good combination of things to do for hemming knits. I think probably, without referring back to it's all about familiarity and skill and what you're happy with, a twin needle with a walking foot on a regular sewing machine is your Rolls-Royce solution on a regular sewing machine for sure. Something that I didn't mention, no one asked about, but it did occur to me when I was thinking about that, was on a lot of machines you can adjust the tension of your foot. So the pressure with which the feed dogs and the foot press together. And that issue that I described about the feed dogs making fabric ripple, because that's something that often goes wrong with knits, is that you get a wavy hem or a wavy line of stitching and you didn't mean to. If you loosen off the tension of how hard the foot is pressing down, then that may actually stop that horrible annoying wavy ripple. Or you may need to tighten it up. You know, experiment with the tension, get the manual out of your machine if you've got it, and see, how do I tighten up the pressure, how do I loosen it off, and then experiment and find out whether it made it better or worse. Do more of it if it was good, do less of it if it was bad. Okay, we now get to the specific mistake that I was going to fix, which was the lifted and poor neckline on that black and white t-shirt that I wore in the last video. Here it is. I have fixed it. It is 1,000 times better, and I'm going to show you how I have done that in the video right now. So first of all, I'm going to show you the problem, and you can see that the neckband stands away from the body of the garment. So that's what the problem was. Then you have to turn it over and find the stitching. When you're unpicking overlocking stitching, you don't actually have to unpick everything. You only need to unpick the parts that the needles stitched. So the looper threads, and from the upper and lower looper you don't need to unpick. So unpick a few of the needle stitches on the wrong side, and then spread open the seam and unpick. Now this took ages. It took me about 20 minutes of my life that I will never get back to unpick this neckband. It is quite tricky unpicking jersey. There we go, we're about halfway through, and you can see that the woolly nylon looper threads have come out in one bit because they haven't been cut. But unpicking jersey, the stitches sink in, and also making a hole in a knitted fabric is actually worse in a way than making a hole in a woven fabric, because the holes can be more troublesome. So do be careful with your unpicker. And then I got to the end. Woohoo! So the seam, the original garment was now a little bit stretched and rippled from having been sewn in and then unpicked and stretched in the process. So I took it to the iron and I laid it out carefully, and I used a lot of steam and I pressed. So partly I didn't touch at all with the iron, but I pressed rather than pushing it around. Then I got the neckband, and instead of just doubling it this time, I folded the neckband into quarters. Melody and Daydream Believer both recommended measuring into quarters, and so I followed their recommendation. It just makes it easier to spread things out evenly. So also I needed to measure the neckband, so I folded it in half to find the front and back, and then I measured and found the exact quarter, because that won't necessarily be at the shoulder seam. In fact, often it won't be at the shoulder seam. And then I pinned it in. So first of all I matched the front, the back and the 2 quarter points. And then how many pins you use is totally a matter of preference, but you need to be really careful matching up the raw edges, because this time, because I'm resewing it, there is no excess. Ta-da! It's a neckline and it lies flat all the way around. So pleased. Do you know what? I would probably normally have not been so perfectionist about it, but you kept me honest, you kept me accountable, and I took it off and I did a much better job, and I'm very pleased about it. So, you know, it just goes to show that you can do it, and if you apply those things that I said in the voiceover just then about how to make things better, then you can get a better neckline. Very pleased. To finish, tomorrow there will be a video all about patterns, and one of the things I'll show you is the pattern for the white t-shirt I was wearing earlier, which has a cowl neck, and that is a very cunning way to avoid having to do a neckband. So I'll tell you which pattern that is, and I'll show you another pattern that has an option like that, and commercial sewing patterns that you can go out and buy that you know are well drafted and you can get on and experiment with sewing knits. Thank you very much for being there. If you want to support my channel, there will be affiliate links to Amazon and eBay below, and you can just click through to the home page and do your regular shopping, and I'll get a small reward and I'll be really grateful. And if you would like to watch another video from the series, the whole playlist is going to be up here. If you would like to watch the latest video that I've uploaded, it's going to be there. And if you want to watch something else entirely, it's going to be down here. And if you want to subscribe, you can click here. Thanks for watching. Bye!